Excellent, wonderful. What a lovely day to talk to you all about closing the gap, innovative finance for urban transformation. A warm welcome to all of you in this high-level session on the 6th of October, 2022. My name is Marijke van Staden. I'm your moderator today in this session. My title, Director of ICLE's Carbon Climate Center, working for ICLE in the city of Bonn, which is also our host city for Daring Cities this year. We have 60 minutes to discuss an extremely important topic. And you will hear very interesting and different perspectives here. So we will go through a couple of rounds of questions from a wonderful lineup of panelists, and then we will have an opportunity to also listen to your questions and would answer these. The session will be recorded and the link will be shared through the WOVA app and it will be accessible in the on the Daring Cities website after the event in the very near future. So let's set the scene. We are facing a climate emergency. This is undisputable. Science is showing us that we are in dire straits, but we're also facing a biodiversity crisis. We are facing a crisis and a time when many people have no access to food, water, or sanitation. We have an urgency to act on so many different issues and areas. How do we prioritize this and how do we finance a response to all of these crises at the same time? We know that climate change will accelerate and intensify other crises that exist, and we're already seeing some of that unfolding around the globe. How do we co-design a fair, inclusive, equitable, bright, and sustainable future? We need innovative finance, and it's needed right away. And our panelists will be talking about these from their different perspectives. Now, this session builds on the Glasgow Climate Pact, which was adopted at COP26. And it highlighted the importance of establishing a higher level of ambition to drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the board, across the whole world, but also scaling up finance and capacity building to enhance our adaptive capacity, to strengthen resilience, and to reduce vulnerability to climate change. Now, this is a huge ask, and this is what we will be discussing today in our session as well. We will be looking at the framing also. The framing, we have wonderful global initiatives that are calling for ambition and also tracking ambition on all these topics, including, of course, the Race to Zero, the Race to Resilience, the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, and on the finance side, the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance, to mention just a few of the wonderful initiatives that ICLE is also part of and committed to. Now, we have our own ICLE Green Climate Cities program, which is our global climate impact program, serving our constituency of 2,500 local and regional governments around the world in 125 countries. This links to the redoubtable and renowned project pipeline called the TAP, the Transformative Actions Program. And together, that is our action space, and that is the space where we are also supporting access to finance and action that moves fast, efficiently, and well planned to make sure that we're moving away from business as usual. You will hear business as usual a lot in the context of we need to move away from what we're currently doing. It's clearly not effective, and we need to step up and be more innovative, but also be more brave to take action, and bold action is needed in this time of emergency. So let's hear more from the people who will be discussing with us today, the people and place-based priorities that are defined, and the perspectives from the financing institutions and organizations that are enabling the flow of finance. How can we collectively catalyze that necessary volume of finance to cities? Now, I would like to introduce my wonderful lineup of panelists, and maybe if we can show that slide. So we have Mayor Abby Binay from the city of Makati in the Philippines, also part of our ICLE Global Executive Committee. We're very happy to have you with us, Mayor Abby. It's such a pleasure also to be able to meet you in person, hopefully later today. Then we have Nigel Jollens from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Nigel is the Associate Director there. Nigel, we are delighted to have you with us, and looking forward to your sharing of the many, many years of experience that you've had to see where do we take it to that next step. We have Sophie de Koning, the Global Manager of the Local Climate Adaptation Living Facility called LOCO from the UNCDF, the UN Capital Development Fund. Sophie, warm welcome to you. Excited to hear what you have to share with us. Errol Ayo, our colleague from the European Commission, advisor on the energy transition and local governance from the Director General Energy. A warm welcome to you, Errol. Again, you also have this wonderful track record, and we've known each other for many, many years, or may I say decades even. Would like to hear from you what the European Commission perspectives are. And last but certainly not least, we have Carmen Vogt from the GIZ, the head of the cities unit. Carmen, we're delighted to have you with us as well. So you're seeing a panel with a tremendous level of expertise and experience, and we're looking forward to understanding and hearing your thoughts. If you have questions, dear participants, please put them in the Q&A or write them down, and then we can have those discussions as well. We'll go through 2 rounds of questions, and looking forward to hearing also from your side. So Mayor Abby, may we start with you, because you are a mayor. We're looking and talking about Makati City, but you're also representing potentially, well, ICLEI as well in your role as a GEXCO member. What are the key action areas in Makati City that you're implementing to address the climate emergency and understanding what is this? Do you have a clue on the investment volume needed to actually implement everything that's on your wish list? The floor is yours.
So the very first thing that we need to do in the areas of that needs to be updated are our existing plans and declaration and pursuant to the declaration of our climate emergency. So we have to update our comprehensive land use plan, our climate change action plan, our maps, our hazardous maps. Those are essential things for you to come up with a bankable project. Because if you don't have a long-term plan or even a short-term plan, then it's not going to work. Of course, the most crucial thing is financing. So how do you finance your climate change adaptation or mitigation plans? So for our general fund, the city has invested from 2021 to 2023, our total budget in the amount of $356,000 for climate change adaptation and $1.1 million for climate change mitigation. And of course, we also have a fund for which is required by law in the Philippines, that we have to allocate a certain portion for disaster reduction and management fund, which is around $13.49 million. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, most of our disaster funds went into COVID to address those issues. So we were not able to use a huge chunk of our budget for climate change. I think this is a global issue that we needed to shift our funds and our financing and somehow diverted our focus from our track towards climate mitigation and climate change actions because of the pandemic. The city has also invested a huge amount of money for equipment and training of our responders. For resiliency, we continuously implement our waste project program, strict enforcement of our existing ordinances regarding greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, the city has adopted the use of renewable energy. We have invested into solar power studs and the use of solar panels for our schools. The very recent one that we were able to do, and I think this is something that I need to share, we were able to get a grant from South Korea, wherein the city will be able to, Korea will be providing us a smart transport system. It will use electric vehicles. It will use online transactions. So it's going to be a wireless transaction where you can just book a ride and you can pay your fare online. And these are the kinds of finances that an LGU or a city needs. The city did not spend a single centavo for the smart transport system. We were given an amount of $13 million US. And the only thing that the city needed to do was to provide for a space for this smart transport system. So Those are key actions that we are doing in the city right now. And of course, the most important thing also is to promote multi-level participation. We require the community, the household, the private companies, the private sector, and of course our NGOs to participate in our climate change adaptation measures. And of course, you won't be able to do this without the help of international organizations similar to ICLE, UNDRR, CCFLA, GCOM, all those organizations that we are part of. I think a lot of cities are missing out by not being able to tap these international organizations, which are essential for us to benchmark and get information on how they do it, what mistakes did they commit, and how did they sustain their projects. So those are key actions for our city.
Thank you so much, Mayor Abby. I think you've given a quick snapshot of an amazingly complex plan, and it's wonderful to hear the diversity of plans that you're using, and the amounts that you need it's astonishing. And this is just one city. So if you just imagine hundreds of thousands of cities around the world need the same amounts or even more, depending on their size and scope and their vulnerabilities. That's scary. I find where is this money going to come from? Let's look to Aero. Maybe Aero, the European Union is one of the biggest, I think, the European Commission is one of the biggest donors also on the finance side, of understanding and supporting climate action around the world, especially also at the local level. But just looking at the European context and the good practices from the European Union, what strategies are there in place now to address the climate emergency? And are there strategies that address specifically showing that they're guaranteeing access to funds or guaranteeing funds that go to the local level? Would be interesting to hear what the perspectives is from the European side.
Thank you, Marieke, and thank you, ICLE, for this organizing this event. Yeah, big questions actually. So if I start with the strategies, I think there's one core strategy, and that is the European Green Deal. And this has set then the climate neutrality target for European Union by 2050. And then so that we wouldn't kick the can down the road too much. So there's a interim target of 55% greenhouse gas reductions in 2030. And these are the ones who drive the action to fight the climate crisis. And there is approximately 1 trillion euro behind this strategy. And that what we ask there is our member states to put 1/3 of all into sustainable investment, so that we give a sort of clear roadmap way to go. And to then achieve these kinds of targets, so the EU lawmakers are currently negotiating a pretty sweeping package of legislative proposals on energy, climate, transportation, and taxation. And this we call the Fit for 55 package. And this is there to set us on a cost-effective and realistic path towards these objectives. And obviously this current war in Ukraine, or also we would call it the energy war, has added urgent proposals to detach EU from the Russian fossil fuels, and then in particularly to accelerate this energy transition, because that's really the real solution to the climate emergency. And then about the advantages that cities have, the European ones, what there is a regulatory frame which favors energy efficiency, renewables, as well as various proposals to cut red tape, for instance, on permitting, so that you can actually build these types of installations like wind parks, for instance. On top of that, there is funding from many of the traditional instruments like cohesion funds and then the ELENA instrument. And these are then reinforced by these kinds of post-COVID recovery budgets. And we hope that soon we will also be mobilizing the so-called Climate Social Fund, which is working on making sure that the transition is also just in the context. And for cities then outside EU, we also offer instruments through our international programs, for instance, in Africa and Latin America. So back to the EU cities, what they have access to is also project development assistance, assistance, such as the European City Facility, and then various non-financial support mechanisms from bottom-up initiatives, such as the Global Covenant of Mayors that you mentioned, Marijke, also Smart Cities Marketplace, and the 100 Climate Neutral Cities Mission. So on top of that, there are all cities that want to join the cities energy saving sprint. They can also get contacts and ideas on what other cities are doing to manage their consumption, because now we're at a state that we have to actually cut consumption, not just be efficient in it. And the challenges in all of this are, of course, managing the social, economic, and inflationary impact of the energy crisis that may very well temporarily drain or divert resources from the clean energy transition. And we know that access to skilled staff is one of these kinds of bottlenecks that sometimes hamper cities from even seeking available funding. So these are the kind of reasons why the European Commission has proposed the so-called Repower EU toolbox. And this is for governments to support their citizens and small and medium-sized enterprises to weather the impact of rising energy prices. And on top of that, what we're doing, we are reviewing, for instance, the way these bottom-up initiatives I just mentioned, how they operate to create more synergies and to help cities in their ambition. Thanks.
Wonderful. You're giving a ray of hope and optimism. It's exciting to hear what is happening in Europe, and also the leadership. I love also the fact that bringing in equity and the just transition is so critical to make sure that we're not leaving people behind and making sure that we're pushing forward. So very exciting to hear those targets and the finance and different opportunities. I assume many of the national governments, I feel, are using or have been using the COVID crisis also to look at revising their green packages, although not many of those are then also including climate angles, sadly. I think this cohesion and bringing thematics together to make sure that we're optimizing our finance packages and finance flows would be probably very important. Maybe this takes me to Carmen. Carmen, you guys from the GIZ have worked with the NDC partnership on an interesting paper and an analysis looking at the needs coming from national governments for sustainable urbanization and what support can go back to the countries to make sure that we deal with this issue of the local governments, the cities as well. Could you give us a snapshot insight into that publication, and maybe also why did GIZ develop this?
Thank you, Marijke. Yes, indeed. This summer, we published a so-called insight brief together with the NDC partnership addressing support gaps for sustainable urbanization in the NDC partnership. The background was the following. Every year, NDC partnership receives large numbers of requests from its member countries on issues where countries need support in their respective NDC process. This can be on diverse areas like project implementation, learning and knowledge sharing, or monitoring and evaluation. And we looked at these requests to understand which role cities and subnational governments play. And the aim was to figure out if and how cities could be better supported through the NDC partnership. We found that requests from cities and subnational governments are on the rise. In fact, I would say only 1 in 10 requests refer to cities and subnational governments. And I think there is still potential for more. And many of them are cross-cutting in nature. And they are not limited to a specific sector and often include both adaptation and mitigation. And this calls for integrated approaches that go beyond urban sectors like mobility, waste, water management, buildings, energy. We also found that 1/3 of requests related to cities and subnational governments have not been supported yet by the NDC partnership and its partners. And the largest gap concerns project preparation and project pipeline development. A big lack of bankable project proposals is still a key barrier for cities, as the mayor already mentioned. to access to finance. And in order to implement NDCs, they need to be translated into tangible projects at the local level. And I think we have to visualize that even in OECD countries, many cities do still not have the capacities required to plan, structure, and finance investments in low carbon and climate resilient urban infrastructure. But we know sufficient capacities of cities and other urban agencies are the basis for developing these kind of pipelines of high quality climate relevant projects. This in turn is a prerequisite to attract finance, and many cities want to shift. We know that many have high ambitions to climate neutrality and more resilience. And yes, in conclusion, to be very brief here, we need to support cities in building strong project pipelines that can be implemented with financing support by international partners, donors, international financing institutions, and not to forget the private sector.
Thank you so much, Carmen. I think a highly recommended document for reading. We will put the link in a little bit later that you can all download and take a look at that as well. I think the NDC partnership, of course, supports national governments to upscale the delivery of their NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. For me, it's wonderful also the work that we're doing with the GIZ, looking at multi-level governance. How do different levels of government work together and work better together? Because this is now, we need to be more efficient, we need to move faster, we need to be better coordinated. And all of that falls under multi-level governance when we're talking about different levels of government working together. So it's important also for national governments, any national representatives on the listening in, please submit your requests for subnational support through the NDC partnership, because this is the place where you can also flag the importance and also show that you feel it is important that local action, climate action gets supported as well. Thank you so much, Carmen, for that. Nigel, let's move to you, looking at it from a financial perspective. You are sitting, I think you're sitting on a pot of gold, if I may call it that. The banks have the finance. How do we get the finance to flow? And I know the EBRD has a very particular mission and a particular purpose, but maybe you could speak a bit more about that and your Green Cities program to tell us what are you doing, because I know this is a very exciting space.
Thank you, Marike, and good morning, everybody. First of all, let me just start off by acknowledging the fantastic work that ICLE is doing and the leadership also being shown by the European Commission. I think these things, you know, what you're doing with COP27 and raising multi-level governance there, and the leadership of the Commission, as well as the support that the Commission is giving in terms of finance, we couldn't do it without you. So first of all, thank you. Secondly, let me just talk a little bit about our Green Cities program. So EBRD Green Cities is now 5 years old. We have, you talk about a pot of gold. We have raised 5 billion euros, which is part of the bank's capital, as well as multi-level, multi-agency donor money, including the Green Climate Fund, as well as bilateral money. So that 5 billion euros is there to support investments, but the investments don't happen on their own. So let me just talk a little bit about how we stimulate investments through what we call our Green City Action Plans. And Mayor Binay mentioned this long-term planning. It's absolutely critical. Now, the challenge with this is you could stop everything that you do in your city in the Philippines, Mayor Binay, and you could do all your planning. But if we were a financial institution and we know the climate emergency is so urgent, how do we continue to do the investments as well as do the planning? And that's one of the things that I think we've really managed to crack with our Green Cities program, because the GCAP, the Green City Action Plan, takes about 12 months to prepare. But from the point of identifying the priority environmental challenges, at that point, which is about 3 to 6 months into the process, the bankers can start coming into the process and identify areas and projects that will contribute to reducing and addressing those environmental challenges. So that's a really important part of our approach. The second thing that we do is because these Green City Action Plans are essentially being developed to stimulate investments, we spend less time on the high level blah blah. There's a big problem, and much more time on developing. And I think it was Carmen mentioned this notion of the tangible projects. So the Green City Action Plan is more about finding bankable actions for the city to undertake and prioritizing those, and they go through the political and the civil society filtering process, so that at the end of the 12 months, the city has a prioritized list of climate actions that they can take, costed, and even identified where the capital will come from. Okay, so that's the first part, that's the planning. I think the superpower that we have as a financial institution is that we're involved in the planning, but we also bring the finance. So we don't just leave the action plan on the table of the mayor. We work with other financiers, including KfW, EIB, the World Bank, to bring together all of the resources that we can, our own capital, as well as concessional capital, so cheap money and grants that the mayor also mentioned is so necessary. And donors are so much more active, no, what's the word? They're so much more willing to contribute if they can see that the projects that they're going to help finance are part of a bigger package. That's what the Green City Action Plan can give, some sort of vision that the city is not just doing random things. So we also are engaged in this implementation. Now, one of the things that we do, and I'll finish off here because I know we're short of time. One of the things that we do is at the bank now, by the 1st of January 2023, all of our investments have to be Paris aligned. It's the same for all of the other multilateral development institutions. And so that means, and we're already implementing this, every single investment that comes out of a Green City Action Plan, we critically review it to maximize its climate ambition. So if a city wanted to invest in new public buildings, we would make sure that we work with the city to ensure that it is thermally efficient, so it has, deals with the energy efficiency, that it maximizes the potential for renewables, rooftops, whatever, and that it then is not going to be engaged using fossil fuels and so on. So in summary, the Green Cities EBRD program has the planning instrument, which is short-term and focused on delivering the practical investments, which we then follow up with finance together with other financial institutions and donors to implement that plan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel, and congratulations on that program. I think it's a fantastic program, and I know ICLEI has been involved in helping you shape and frame it, and we're very proud of that achievement and looking forward to scaling up as much as possible. Exciting news. I'm getting more confident that we might just be able to crack this difficult nut. Now let's move to a very practical program, the local climate adaptive living facility with Sophie. Sophie, I don't want to ask two technical questions because I know the colleagues online maybe might not be finance experts, but they're interested in finance. So maybe if you could very briefly explain, what does Local do and how do you deal with non-market mechanisms established under the Paris Agreement, the Article 6.8, if you could briefly explain that to the colleagues.
Thank you, Marika, also for the opportunity to participate in the panel. So the Local Climate Adaptive Living Facility supports countries in establishing country-based financing mechanism to deploy climate finance to the local level. So that is what we're doing. I'll come back to that. But when it comes to the Paris Agreement and Article 6.8, so we're working with countries and local governments. We're talking here about multi-level action or multi-level governance to position their work under the Article 6.8. So Article 6.8 is a key part of the Paris Agreement, sometimes forgotten, but it's very important for those of us that are working with countries and local governments to adapt to climate change. Because essentially Article 6.8 is the only entry point that can provide a space for advancing cooperative approaches that can address adaptation at scale And following that, the working assumption is that also finance would follow some of these approaches. So the so-called non-market approach can serve, therefore, as windows to deploy support and channel finance to countries for implementation of adaptation investment, other investment as well, but here we're looking at adaptation investment and local ones, which are presently, as we know, receiving really a smaller portion of global climate finance, the adaptation already, but also when it comes to the local level action. So Local has been working through an instrument of performance-based grants with countries for the last 10 years, helping them reform, in a way, adjust, strengthen their country system using intergovernmental fiscal transfers for local level action. It's a proven mechanism at this point, well documented. There are 34 countries across Africa, Asia, Pacific, and the Caribbean that are using it or designing it, and they are giving their trust into that system. In fact, they're also working together to make it an ISO standard, which is pending, and we hope will be released at COP27. They've been working on that for the last couple of years, and with that experience track record, it is actually a very good candidate as a non-market approach under the Paris Agreement to support increased delivery of finance. The evidence of that is that a number of countries actually we're going now into the negotiation in the sense that the countries, you mentioned the national governments earlier and how they might wish to work with the local governments. The national governments are making submissions to the UNFCCC to present Local as such an existing non-market approach. Last week, the LDC group, which represents 46 countries, made a submission. Earlier in the year, the Africa group of negotiators also referenced it, and countries that are quite strong in negotiations like Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are also making individual submissions. So, I mean, we will be supporting them so that such recognition can pave the way for increased support and access next to climate finance for local adaptation. Currently, there are 322 local governments engaged, but if this work can go to scale, considering the countries engaged are planned to double. There are 17 countries asking for this kind of support. The reach can be significant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. That's also a very exciting news. I think one of the pieces of the puzzle that maybe is quite challenging still is many national governments understand the need for local climate action, but in my view, and we hear this from a lot of from our cities that we're speaking to, that they're not listening to the local priorities. So this place-based, people-based priorities. Nigel was speaking to climate action plans that take 12 months to develop. It's also because you have stakeholder consultation. You need to understand who are your vulnerable people who have no voice, and make sure that the local government gives them a voice. So it's wonderful to hear that this specific focus on adaptation is in place, and wishing you much success with Local, and looking forward also to see how we can collaborate on that piece. Very important. So we've seen very different approaches, but all of them have a very clearly defined purpose. Now, if we look at the second round of questions, I want to zoom in a little bit into more detail. And Mayor Abby, if we may come back to you again as our mayor. You mentioned the race to resilience. You mentioned making cities resilient 2030 as very important initiatives, and a call to other mayors to sign up, to join forces and to learn and share in this space. But if we go back to Makati City, what are maybe your two main challenges that you face, but you know where resilience needs to be stepped up? If you can explain the actual problem and the local impact of climate change and the need for resilience, what are your main challenges that you need to deal with, where a lot of investment would be needed?
Well, there's always a short-term and a long-term goal for your resiliency, and we make sure that we're sticking to our short-term and long-term plans. So the very typical daily collection and proper waste disposal, our landfill, develop our roadmap to reduce water consumption and eliminate pollution. Those are very typical short-term plans, but we also wish to implement a whole of society approach where we would establish inclusive approaches to governance with balanced economic and comprehensive strategies that integrate climate, social, and health objectives. So even on a budget level, during the budgeting process, we already include our climate change initiatives. We ensure a just transition when developing climate and resiliency strategies and other policies in the city, wherein we make sure that even the private sector are properly informed or consulted even before we do the during the formulation of these strategies. And together with the again, I've noticed that we've frequently mentioned that there is a national and a subnational and a city level. If the national government is not prioritizing climate change actions, then it becomes a city priority. But the thing is, the city can't do it if the neighboring city is not doing it. It really has to be a collective effort towards resiliency. I can't be resilient, but my neighbor who's just like half a kilometer away isn't resilient. They'll just end up coming to my city in case of a disaster. So of course, we have our long-term plans as well as since Makati recently declared a climate emergency to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate the impact of climate change. These are investing in a resilient energy grid, adopting a green building code, and give incentives for the construction of energy efficient infrastructures. And I have previously discussed the introduction of a smart public transportation system, and we hope to be able to introduce accessible plant-based food sources for our constituents.
Wonderful, a lovely wide range of activities, and absolutely your message is really clear. Short-term and long-term plans, you need to keep that perspective, making sure that you serve your constituency, your people, and protect them, of course, over time, making sure that this is the whole
and hopefully,
system.
even if I'm not the mayor, the next mayor will still do it and stick to the plan, because that's really important. Continuity is important. Yes.
Yep. The continuity has been a major challenge. We've seen that globally as well, especially when you change between political parties. The new mayor wipes everything off the table and starts afresh, and that is disastrous for the climate emergency as well. We need that continuity, and I think the cities that we've seen that have been really the most effective and actually achieving their targets consistently, there have been cross-party political consensus that climate change is the priority and that they will build on previous plans. And especially if you consider developing a bankable project, it comes from an idea. You have an idea, you put it in your climate action plan, you unfold the plan into a proper project, and then you look for financing or for technical assistance to build your project into a more robust concept. This takes time. I've heard of some of the colleagues at banks saying up to 10 years. We don't have 10 years to think of every single project. We need to condense that timeline substantially as well. And maybe that's a question, would be good, maybe Nigel, if we can jump to you. How do we tighten up that framework and get the support, the technical assistance support flowing faster and more efficiently? And maybe if we can also, if you could touch on what is the CCFLA, would be good to do some promotion for the CCFLA as well.
Okay, yeah. Well, so on your first question about how to tighten up and make these things efficient, I think the really important thing is, as I said, developing these Green City Action Plans, developing the long-term plans that Mayor Binay has just mentioned. They need to be done really efficiently, and they need to, okay, so there's a critical to get civil society involved and the political process involved, so they don't, so that they have a mandate, a political mandate. But doing that really efficiently, and that's something that we've, I think, doing relatively well at the EBRD. I'm sure there's room for improvement. And the other thing is that internally within financial institutions, if they're going to be, if these projects are going to be bankable, they have to still go through a standard integrity and financial due diligence process. There's no shortcut for that. What can we do to improve that? We can improve the efficiency within our own internal banking system, and we can help clients understand what's required as part of that due diligence process. And that's part of the technical assistance we do within the GCAP process. So we don't just build capacity on developing a plan. We give them the opportunity to learn about how a financial institution thinks and how to develop a project proposal that would be attractive to a financial institution. In terms of the CCFLA, you know, these international groups are absolutely critical. I would say they're necessary, absolutely necessary, but they're not sufficient. They're necessary for banging the drum, for making sure that they keep finance and cities on the agenda, and the CCFLA have done a great job on that, I think. And I think the other thing that they can do is convene, and this is something that ICLE does well as part of that overall kind of network of cities, convening not just the like minds, but the people also who are a little bit on the fringes, who are a bit skeptical, to bring them into the fold and convince them that there is actually a market for this kind of investment. I say it's not sufficient, and I think we probably all agree that all the other parties need to be part of this. Financial institutions, okay, we've got the multilaterals, we've got the intergovernmental financial institutions, but we need private banks involved. That's absolutely critical. And we see some of them, but we don't see all of them. And that, I think, is a problem. We need business, we need government and civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. I'd love to invite you to another session where we can go deeper into all of this, and maybe let's invite all the development banks and all the public and finance institutions to come and learn to see how to do this in an efficient way and exchange on good practices. That'd be wonderful. Since we're now talking about global instruments as well, maybe Sophie, could you zoom in a little bit again back to locale? If you would share is the language climate emergency very much part of your daily language? Are you talking with the national governments who are applying there? Do they understand the urgency for action? And how do you deal with that level of urgency? How do you prioritize the selection of projects?
Thank you, Marike. I think there is an increasing demand from the central level government for this kind of solution, working across levels with their local governments. I mean, the evidence of that from our experience is that over the last 2-3 years, I mean, originally, at the early stage of this work, UNCDF would possibly engage with government. Now we get demand from the government, and it's often ministries in charge of climate or environment or finance, and then they bring also ministries of local governments on board. So it means that the demand keeps increasing. There, like I mentioned, there are currently 34 countries, but it's like 2, 3, 4 countries, ask and join every year without really, calling them to do so. So I think there is a demand really for this kind of solution. What is also possibly converging is that it's using the country system. So it speaks to central government as well as local government, and it's addressing this vertical integration. The countries also work through a phased approach. So of course, there are steps that we need to go through so that the system is put in place, is robust, because we're working with intergovernmental fiscal transfer systems to make sure that there is this additionality and traceability of the climate funds. Otherwise, it will be really difficult for countries to access climate funds or even convince their own Ministry of Finance to invest themselves in addressing those localized climate risks. But we see that demand really coming through, and some countries are very fast in actually going to scale. Countries like Mozambique are now deploying this kind of solution with 30 districts. That is a very large country, as you know. Solomon Island is one of the recent one. It's the government that led immediately the positioning of the instrument with donors in the region. And as a result, they will be able to go to the 9 provinces from year 1 as the contracts are signed. So I think there is that sense. Of course, it's not always that fast, but we feel that. And in terms of emergency, we also see more and more countries addressing disaster risk reduction issues and climate change adaptation simultaneously. It is the case by policy in a number of countries, notably the small island developing states, but also in other countries, we see this opportunity to link those issues at the local level. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Carmen, would you maybe share a brief insight? Also, the GIZ is also involved in the GAP Fund. Could you maybe share briefly what is the opportunity there for local governments to apply as part of one of the project preparation facilities that's available out there?
Yes, thank you very much. Generally, I would say prerequisite and also for the application is the demand from the cities. In this regard, it is really important that the demand comes from the local context, and the GAP fund and also as other project preparation facilities as the C40 Cities Finance Facility don't offer a one-fits-all solution. So the concrete project and the investment should be very concrete. And what the GAP fund, of course, is offering to develop capacities, identify and choose the best suitable means for designing and financing the project. And so the GAP fund, as well as the city's finance facility, can act as a translator between the finance sector and the cities, and also bring this to the market. I also would like to mention very briefly in this context, and this is also very relevant for the project preparation facilities, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. The commitment at the last COP that over $130 trillion of private capital will come to economy for net zero. And I think this is crucial, as cities are also about 80% of the economy, and this is also something the project preparation facilities as the GAP fund and others should be considered.
Thank you very much. Indeed, we didn't talk much about the private sector, but I think the private sector has a massive role to play. Public funding will just not be adequate and enough for what really needs to be doing globally. I think maybe for those of you online who are not familiar, so the C40 Climate Finance Facility, the ICLEI's Transformative Actions Program are essentially project pipelines inviting local governments and, in the case of the subnational governments, to submit their priority projects, which then seek investment and finance. And we take them through a project preparation support, ideally handing over to the financing agencies, to the EBRDs and the others in the world to do the real proper investment. We see a massive need for local projects that are looking for investment where the municipal budgets are just not adequate. And indeed, the GAP Fund and others were created to deal with these pieces. The GAP Fund specifically is for up to project pre-feasibility stage. So take a look at those opportunities. The links have been shared in the chat function as well. I'd like to take our last panelist, Hero. If you could maybe give us a ray of further sunshine with your messaging. Again, the European Commission and the European Union is quite a leader in this space. What immediate action could the European Commission take now to enable emergency climate action? And maybe if you can frame that in the context of the Global Covenant of Mayors, for example. The Global Covenant of Mayors is one of the biggest alliances of city networks and local governments committed to tackle climate change. They are committed to address mitigation, adaptation, but also access to energy, so access to renewable energy. There's such a huge demand, and we've got more than 10,000 committed local governments and cities at the moment. I see that as a very catalytic space. What do you think could the European Commission do to help that move forward, that we get this technical support to the local governments that have made that clear commitment?
Thanks, Marijke. Before I go to that, actually, I must say this is super interesting. All these comments that have been made here by Mayor Binay and Nigel and Sophie and Carmen and others. So it really brings a lot of ideas in my mind. And I think that just commenting on what Mayor Binay said about this continuity of the plans over years, you have to and the political risks that are there. So this is of course a key challenge, and it's interesting to see that some cities have actually found sort of quite innovative ways how to handle that. And I'm thinking of just the city of Leuven in Belgium, which is one example, but there are many others. And interesting to see how they did this, so that there the city hall basically, in a way, outsourced the management of the transition of the city to a kind of a special purpose vehicle, kind of a, call it a company, which brings together all the stakeholders, the private sector, NGOs, academia, and of course also the city, but with like shared decision making on how the plan should be drawn up and implemented. And this has created a kind of a like a positive spiral of actions, and also taking a bit of distance from the mayor's office, and therefore there's a bigger chance that those plans will actually be implemented, even if there's a change in the election. So that type of things are super important. And then also, obviously, the multi-level governance, many of you have spoken about that. So, okay, in the EU context, what we've been doing is then giving like a legal right for the local and regional authorities to be there to be involved in drawing up and updating the plans, which are the ones that deliver on the NECP, the European NECP. And we're now looking into giving guidance actually based on the sort of experiences we've had, how to make it more, stronger, that involvement, because we really need them, the local regional authorities. It's 70% of people live in cities in Europe, and 70% of legislation is implemented actually at local level. So it's obvious that that's where we go. Anyway, now a bit more to your question. The global covenant of mayors, indeed, that is one of the very important tools that we have, or initiatives where we work with Michael Bloomberg, and this one is really looking into developing, of course, capacities, helping with information, helping with the connections between the cities, because this type of everything starting from good practice sharing between the peers is very important. But I think, like there was the example, was it Sophie who mentioned that what's happening in Mozambique, for instance. So this good practice sharing, or particularly the implementation, it works even better when there's a bit of a top down from the higher levels of the government, that they spot those good practices and they spread them regionally. So that's the ideal thing. Anyway, these are some examples of issues that are discussed, of course, in the GCOM, and then obviously the GAP fund, which has been mentioned already there. Now, I'm going a little bit into practical concerns, or let's say practical situation where we stand today, and that's again because of the war in Ukraine. So we are in a setting where saving energy has all of a sudden become a very high priority, of course, particularly in Europe, where the energy prices are the highest in the world now, and 5-10 times higher actually compared to a year ago. So that is somewhere where again we connect Global Covenant into this, and bringing sort of very fast ideas on the table on how do we survive basically the next winter. That's like our perspective. And there these kinds of ideas that happen in the cities are implemented in the cities in Europe, and I think I would believe also some outside Europe, are very concrete things. How the city can give practical energy advice on how to save, how to improve energy efficiency, and that can be really concrete things like helping people adjust the temperature of their hot water boilers. To give a concrete example, there are various types of low-cost measures, like insulation of windows, doors, changing of consumption patterns on energy-consuming household appliances. These are all looking into urgent reduction of the consumption to get the prices down, or at least contain them to some extent. And in these, to do anything like that, or the longer term for that matter, so the right type of communication is super important. And what we hear over and over again, many examples, is that we should actually, and the cities should communicate on, why these kind of like transition measures, not based on climate change necessarily, but rather on on the how it improves the quality of life, be it, less
Absolutely.
pollution and all these kinds of things, really concrete things that touch everyone and also give ideas what you can do about those things. So that type of things are really, really important. And
Absolutely.
that's, again, the kind of things which are happening there. And I'm probably over speaking my term, so I stop here.
Thanks, Eero. Well, the perspective is it's also the practical actions that we should have implemented a long time ago become now urgent. The moment we face a crisis, whether it's a war or a disaster, then suddenly people wake up and again think, what should we do? We should have done all of this long time ago. Now is a good time to start if we haven't done it yet. I would like to thank you all so much. I think you've given us, again, it was just a snapshot and a hint that we are going in the right direction on innovative finance. And my sense is next time we need to bring in the private sector into this conversation as well. They're a missing component. But looking at people and place-based local demand projects for climate that are defined by the local governments need to get priority financing in my view. I hope we can also step up in that space collectively. In the CCFLA, the Cities Climate Leadership Finance Alliance, we're also looking at systems change. What do we need to change to move this on a drastic scale? And that conversation will be reignited in the not too far future. And then that technical assistance flowing to local governments that they understand how to define priority projects and how to implement them. But above all, the skill sets. We need more people with the right skill sets, and investment into people has to also be improved to build the necessary human capacity and human capital that we can make sure that we can actually implement all these wonderful visions that we have co-created. Thank you so much, my dear panelists. It's been a real pleasure to see you virtually, to have you with us, and we hope to continue the conversation and deepen the conversation as over time as well. We will now listen to a video from our high-level champion from the UK, Nigel Topping. Is kindly sharing some perspectives also on this whole point of race to zero, race to resilience. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
With only a few weeks to go to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, I'm delighted to be invited to speak at ICLEI's Daring Cities 2022 event. Because it's clear that the climate battle will be won or lost in cities. And the urgent, ambitious climate action for a green, just and inclusive recovery is needed now more than ever. The scale of the recent disaster in Pakistan tells us the story. It's truly staggering. Over 33 million people displaced and 1/3 of the country underwater. And that's a snapshot of the more than 3 billion people today living in hotspots highly vulnerable to climate change, which is going to lead to more than 132 million additional people falling into extreme poverty by 2030. So the world is undergoing this rapid socioeconomic and technological transformation at the same time. Cities are already home to over half of the global population, with more than 1 billion urban dwellers living in informal settlements, in slums and shacks. And by 2050, the urban population is expected to grow to 68% of the global population. And by 2100, more than 90% of the world's population is projected to live in urban cities. So if we're going to solve any problems, we've got to solve them in cities. And climate change undoubtedly presents one of the most significant risks, in particular to Africa's sustainable development objectives, with so much development still to come over the next decades, and particularly this decade. Now, the vast majority of cities and towns have between 15 and 80% of people living in informal, unplanned or precarious housing. And UNEP estimates that 60% of the built environment needed in African cities by 2050 doesn't yet exist. So the more than 1 billion people who live in urban slums and informal settlements are particularly vulnerable to climate impacts because many of them live along waterfronts or riverbanks or in floodplains prone to flooding. And of course, cities act as the first responders to the direct impacts of climate change in their constituencies. City leaders are, by definition, closer to their citizens than national leaders. And nowhere is the threat of climate change more imminent than along the coastline, with more than 90% of the world's urban areas located along coasts. And recent scientific estimates show that sea levels could rise by over a metre by 2100, further compounding the many hazards already threatening global cities. And about 30 million Africans live within the flood hazard zone around the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, out of which 2 million are likely to be flooded each year. I repeat that, 2 million are likely to be flooded each year. So cities need support to unlock investment in urban resilience. And at COP26, new records in mobilisation for adaptation funds were reached, and a 2-year work programme on the global goal for adaptation was launched. But of course, cities, especially those in the global south, are continuing to face major technical and institutional constraints in accessing climate finance, particularly for adaptation. We know that today just 21% of climate finance goes towards adaptation and resilience. It's about $17 billion annually. And only around 10% of climate investments reach the local level. Obviously, that's not enough. By 2030, UN Environment estimates that the developing world will have to spend up to $300 billion a year just to cope with climate impacts. So it's critical that at COP27 we continue to reinforce the multi-level radical collaboration that's required to drive transformation in our finance system and unlock the flow of climate capital. And the path must begin with ease of access to sustainable and innovative finance. From ministers to mayors, from businesses and the private sector, from NGOs and civil society, we need to focus on building partnerships through radical collaboration, because every one of those actors needs to play their role in unlocking finance. No one can just say, hey, I've got a great project and wait for finance to flow. Everyone's got to play their part in collaborating. And the private sector can make a unique contribution to adaptation. In fact, I'm fed up of people saying there's no investment case in adaptation. Of course there is, because we know that the world's economy will be much bigger if we invest in adaptation. The question is, how do we collaborate to unlock the finance through innovative technology, through design of resilient infrastructure, and the development of improved information systems and improved ways of assessing the fiscal return from investing in resilient infrastructure. So local and regional governments have a crucial role to play here. Cities across the world are developing 1.5 degree aligned climate action plans that includes clear plans for investing in resilient infrastructure that will need public and private investment. And it's through this action on the ground that cities can show that they are the engines of change and that they can be the beacons of hope for future generations, creating the jobs, creating the livelihoods, creating the neighbourhoods that will attract people to do what they've always done best in cities, come together and mix and learn and innovate. And that's this role of cities in catalysing solutions to the climate crisis, often going faster than national governments, enabling resilience, building social value through radical collaboration, and driving ambition to win the race to resilience and the race to zero together cannot be underestimated. Cities are the key to winning those races for every country. The city's race to resilience is defining urban resilience as the capacity of a city's systems, businesses, institutions, communities and individuals to survive, adapt and grow in face of climate shocks. And the city's race to resilience is the primary initiative for cities to join the global Race to Resilience campaign that offers cities themselves the unique opportunity to showcase their action, to drive ambition and to learn from peers. All of us, mayors, elected officials, business leaders and residents of urban communities worldwide have a role to play in building the equitable and sustainable cities of the future. There is no time to waste. Thank you.